How you guys doing? Good. Everybody good? Yeah. All right. Well, it's great to be back in Columbus, my second home. I'm renting a house here soon. Not really, but it feels like I should. Hold on one second. Let me move this around. Hey, Sarah, how you doing? Yeah, it's great to be here. I didn't even mind the what is it, like 85% humidity or something like that y'all got here? California, it's really hot all the time, but I cannot get used to that humidity. So welcome from all over the country, right? Most of y'all? Different parts of the country? Great. This is fantastic. So today, what I thought I would do is just tell you a little bit about the story behind the book that I wrote, but also about this epidemic, how this epidemic got started, where and why, and by whom this thing got started, and maybe a little bit about what it says about, I guess maybe our country, who we become, I think, as Americans. Strangely enough, this story starts in 1980, in my opinion, when a doctor in University of Boston University, who runs a database of hospital patient records, and his name is Herschel Jick, had been asking information of this data, crunching the numbers, and about how drugs were used in hospitals. At one point, he told me, I interviewed this fellow, still alive. He told me, I got in my mind I would wanted to know what the effect of narcotic painkillers was on people when they were used in hospital, and how many folks got addicted to those drugs once they left the hospital. So that's what he does. He crunches the numbers and comes up with, of his database of 300,000 patients at the time, 11,000 were given these pills, these medicines while in hospital, and of those, 4 got addicted. He writes this up in a 101-word letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, and in January of 1980, the New England Journal of Medicine publishes this letter stating his findings from this thing under the headline, "Addiction Rare in Patients Treated with Narcotics." At about that time, around the early 80s, on another side of the country, in Canoga Park, San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, a group of immigrants from a small town in a small state in Mexico. The state is Nayarit. The name of the town is Jalisco, tiny little town, 20,000 in a county of about 45,000 people, had congregated in this area, Canoga Park, Van Nuys area. A few of them had figured out how to cook black tar heroin from the opium poppies that grow fairly well up in the mountains of Mexico. Only a few of these families knew how to do this at the time, and they developed a business selling heroin, shipping off little pieces of heroin to addicts who come up to them in the parks. In time, they began to congregate. People from that area began to congregate there, and more of them got into this business. And in time, it kind of saturated the area. The system that they eventually evolved became kind of like a pizza delivery system. Instead of just selling in the parks, they began to send drivers out to deliver their heroin to addicts. They expanded their population of potential customers, and it got them away from the cops. The cops couldn't see them as easily as when they were in the parks. It was a system that began to develop in the mid 1980s in Los Angeles. It had several hallmarks that were very different from most drug trafficking. First of all, there was no guns. Nobody was shooting it out. They didn't shoot each other. They all knew each other. They were all from the same town. They couldn't kill each other. So they cooperated. They competed and accepted lower profits after a while. They paid their drivers, and rarely in drug trafficking from Mexico do you have people salaried employees. But these guys, these drivers, most of them that they would send out were salaried employees, and it would work very much like a system, so a pizza delivery system. So the addict would call an operator would, back then it was pay phones and then pagers, operator would dispatch the driver to go deliver the dope to the customer. And these were not cartel killers. These were guys who common, ordinary young men from the village who had been bakers or butchers or avocado workers, sugarcane farmers as well. And in time, they saturated the San Fernando Valley. And in time, this business model, various families working it, did what any capitalist enterprise does, and it began to expand. Meanwhile, through the late 1980s and then into the 1990s, there developed a kind of a pain crusader kind of mentality among a number of pain specialists, pain specialists across the country. These were younger doctors who had grown up watching the way opiates were not used and should have been used. Frequently in those years, dying cancer patients would be in utter agony as they spent their last months or weeks or what have you, and doctors were still so afraid of addiction that they would not prescribe these pills. They grew up watching this, a bunch of young doctors, young Turks kind of, grew up and formed a kind of collective consciousness, meeting each other at conferences and seminars and whatnot, that this was wrong, and they developed a kind of a crusade to change the way we thought of opiate painkiller, narcotic painkiller use in the United States. They began to argue for a greater liberalization of these pills, of these medicines. And in fact, they very quickly won the argument about about terminal cancer patients. They began to say, people began to realize what's the reason for not using this medication if people only have 3 months to live? Why do we care if they're addicted the last 3 months? Better that they have a decent last few days on Earth. And they began to argue for greater and expanded use of these pills, and they won that argument very quickly. They came to believe, however, that these pills actually should be used for far more than just simply terminal cancer patients, all kinds of pain. They kind of took that revolutionary fervor and that crusaders mentality that was needed to break through old ideas, and it kept on going. That pendulum that they began to push in the late 80s began to swing, and it didn't stop until it became an argument that we should use opiate painkillers for almost every kind of pain, regardless of the patient and the patient's background. They came to believe, in fact, that these pills were virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. The problem is they had no proof of this. They looked and they looked and they looked, and the only piece of evidence that they found that this was true was that 101-word letter written by Herschel Jick and published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. That became kind of the cornerstone of this revolution that they were staging in America at that time. It became the kind of the intellectual cornerstone of this revolution. And in time, it became promoted by these pain specialists at seminars and conferences across the country. In time, it became not a letter to the editor, but a report that says we ought to really change how we think about these pills. Then it became known as a study. No one had ever read this thing. Everyone was kind of quoting, people who were quoting, people who were quoting, people who were citing it. It became a study. Then it became a landmark report. Then it became a landmark study in Time magazine 2001 called this one little letter. A landmark study that does much to change what we know about addiction and pain treatment in America. And it was totally, at that point, they had kind of departed entirely from any evidence-based idea. At the time, as this was going on, those guys from Jalisco Nayarit with their heroin system was beginning to expand. They were part, really, of a larger story that's very important to the story that we have today. Back in the 1970s, a lot of our heroin came from the Far East. Came from Burma, Turkey, Thailand, etc. Those countries, 10, 15,000 miles away. In the 1980s, that changed. Heroin from Colombia, heroin especially from Mexico, began to simply outcompete the heroin from the Far East. And by the end of the 1980s, almost all our heroin, virtually all our heroin, came from either Colombia on the eastern side of the United States, or Mexico on the western side of the United States. But nobody paid any attention to that. Why? Because there was no new population of addicts. Heroin was this old drug. No one paid no one cared. People were more focused on cocaine, of course, crack, methamphetamine, etc. And this happened really unbeknownst to anybody, but really the DEA and some local cops. The folks from Jalisco, Nayarit, this little town south of Arizona, about 10 hours by car, were part of that. They began to expand. First they left the San Fernando Valley, first it was San Diego, then it was Pomona, Ontario, then it was Reno, Portland, Denver, Phoenix, through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. They began to expand throughout the western United States. And they did so with two things, without guns, with two things. With marketing, discounting their dope, giving you a free hit on Sunday if you buy from me every day, 6 days a week. I'll give you a free one on Sunday. I'll give you five balloons of heroin if you find me another for every customer you find me. This kind of thing. They were not this. We have this idea of drug trafficking kind of being like a bunch of cartel killers. These were terrified young kids, basically, who'd never left home, spoke no English. Didn't know anything about America, were paid $500 a week to drive around in this operator, this kind of pizza delivery system. We think of, as I said, cartels, but most drug trafficking from Mexico is not that way. It's a lot of independent operators, small timers, all across the country. It's just more people work that way than work the cartel thing. These guys were looking for enough money to be able to go home and buy some land, buy a truck, and convince a girl that they were worth marrying. As they expanded, I always had the question of, as they expanded across the country, cops would arrest these guys because they were very easy to arrest. They were driving around with their mouths full of little balloons of heroin. It was easy to spot these guys. My question was always, how could they get more people to join forces, to come and work if all their friends were getting arrested? And I found it in a couple of ways. That proves to me kind of crucial to how this system spread. One was, they figured out that the system, this black tar heroin delivery system, like pizza, was a perfect way of accumulating large stacks of Levi's 501 jeans. This system, they took advantage of the fact that the addicts that they were selling to were magnificent shoplifters. They could go through a JCPenney's or a Sears or a Target and clean it out. And in time, these traffickers began giving them lists. Levi's of Levi's 501 sizes, colors. Levi's 501 jeans, and during these years, were the kind of the gold standard of rural Mexican menswear. They said if you had a pair of Levi's 501 jeans, you walked around the plaza at Friday night, were seen as having arrived. They were a stark contrast to the cheap Mexican jeans that wore out very quickly and looked bad. So in time, these guys began to see that if they could trade a hit of dope for a pair of Levi's 501 jeans, and they would take them home in stacks, pack their car, and take them home for Christmas or for a fiesta back home in the village, and they would give them away as if they were Santa Claus. Kids around the village saw this and began to think, damn, and saw all the girls kind of flocking to these guys with their new jeans and most of their new hats and maybe also a new truck, and began to think, I want to do that. And after a while, kids around the county were raising their hands saying, yeah, I want to go up north to sell heroin like pizza, drive a heroin around, because I want to come back and have my own pair of Levi's 501 jeans. The other thing that happened was, I spent a lot of time all across Mexico, traveling all across Mexico. I went to many, many, many immigrant villages. In every immigrant village, what you see coming out of the tops of the houses is rebar. Those like electric, that kind of like iron bars, right? The reason for that is that people build their houses piecemeal. There's no loans that allows a poor Mexican, working class Mexican to build a house all at once. So people come here, work as a landscaper, send their money home, and over a period of 8 or 10 years, they add on to the house, piece by piece by piece. Takes 8 or 10 years, and when they're done with the first floor, they put rebar up. One of the reasons for that is to say, I'm going to build a second story when I get the money. All across Mexico, you go to small villages, immigrant villages, where everyone's up here working, and you will see rebar sticking out. The one place I've been to in Mexico where I saw no rebar was Jalisco, Nayarit. Jalisco, Nayarit, the home of this pizza delivery system. There was no rebar because the guys there were able to make enough money to build their house in 9 months instead of 9 years. And when they would do that, they would build on like wrought iron. They had, one guy told me, a guy he knew went north, built a house with an automatic garage door opener in the little village near Jalisco where he was. No one had ever seen an automatic garage door opener, and so they would stand out, and people would stand out in front of the house. Watch the automatic garage door go up and down and up and down. Those jeans and houses without rebar, automatic garage, these were recruiting posters for heroin traffickers from this one town, and provided the labor that it needed to expand all across, at first, the western United States. And and so it expanded. And the cops could not arrest enough of them because there was always more kids raising their hand back home to say, I'll come up and take that guy's place who just went to prison. They became great marketers. They developed personal connections with their addicts. They urged the addicts to stick with them, gave away free dope. And of course, this was also a time they had to learn how to market, because this was a time when there was no growth of the addict population, heroin opiate addict population in the United States. This was the early mid-1990s. By the mid-1990s, the pain revolution, meanwhile, was fully underway. That we were told that we had an epidemic of pain in America. This was also a time when pharmaceutical companies were in the middle of a sales force arms race, so every company was hiring more and more salespeople to visit doctors, tripping over them as they went to their offices. There was an idea that pain is what the patient says it is. And so you always said, it was like I could change in the attitude, the relationship between patient and doctor. The patient was kind of telling the doctor what the doctor needed to do. We had an attitude, I think, in this country began to develop that doctors are there to fix us. That we are entitled as Americans to a life free of pain. Doctors were beginning to be pressured to prescribe these opiates for all manner of pain that they would never have tried 10 years before. They were re-educated, were going to continuing medical education seminars, taking pain seminars, telling them how they needed to very, very aggressively address people's pain. At the urging of pharmaceutical companies, pain was deemed the fifth vital sign, which of course it is not. It is not a vital sign. It's not like a pulse or blood pressure where you can measure it with a machine every day, every person. Very, very subjective. At the same time, doctors were subjected to patient evaluations, which told them whether or not they had sufficiently treated the patient's pain. And this probably started as a good idea, but it basically became an idea that a mechanism through which patients extorted pills, because if you don't doctor prescribed me enough of the pills that I'm looking for, I'm going to write you a bad evaluation. This became part of the pressures on doctors in the mid-1990s to change how they thought about how these pills were used. There were also at this time there was the idea that there was no limit on dose. If 100 milligrams wasn't enough, then maybe 150 was going to work. Then if that didn't work, after a while 200, then 300 perhaps. After a while people were on very high doses as they are today, 700, 800 milligrams of opiate painkillers per day. Through it all, the idea that less than 1% of all patients who were treated with pain, with these narcotic painkillers, would grow addictive gain currency. That comes only from one place, and that's this letter to the editor written by Herschel Jick in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980. In 1996, the game changer was OxyContin. Purdue Pharma produces OxyContin. We wouldn't have a heroin problem today in America if it were not for OxyContin. We can get into that more later if you like. But it was promoted as virtually non-addictive, and that less than 1% of all patients who use it would get addicted, coming straight out of Herschel Jick and that letter in 1980. Purdue Pharma put on one of the kind of legendary, and some might say infamous, promotional campaigns for a drug ever in the history of pharmaceutical marketing, promoting it to doctors with phone pads and fishing hats and continuing medical education seminars in which they sponsored people who would also basically promote the drug. They also gave away a little CD called "Swing in the Right Direction" with OxyContin. It had songs from Woody Herman and Count Basie, all these swing tunes from the 1940s. They gave away free coupons for a week's worth of OxyContin for about a few years, several years there, 4 or 5 years I think it was. They followed that up with constant, relentless doctor visits by an enormously expanded sales force now, up to 1,000 people. Yeah, this was a small number actually. Other pharmaceutical companies had many more. But for a company that was marketing an opiate, it was marketing an opiate as if it was an over-the-counter drug. And in time, what you can say, the moral of the story is that advertising worked. You can see opiate painkiller prescribing in 1996. For years it's just stable, and in 1996 it takes off like an airplane from a runway and keeps on going up and up and up, and hasn't so far. And I think it's leveled off maybe now, but for years it did not. A country that had been one of the most reluctant users, prescribers of narcotic painkillers became one of the most aggressive. Hydrocodone went from 1993, 5 tons I believe it was, production worldwide, to 42 tons of hydrocodone worldwide in 2010, 20 years later, and 99% of that used right here in this country. Ground zero for all of this is right where we are sitting right now. Columbus, Cincinnati, West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, parts of Western Pennsylvania, Indiana, etc. This whole area was where this was first felt, and first where the consequences were also first seen. I learned this story over several years as a reporter with the Los Angeles Times, covering the drug trafficking in America. I was covering heroin trafficking basically when I first started this. As I did, I learned how this affected various parts of the country, including the one where we're sitting right now. And one of the stories that I came upon was the town of Portsmouth, Ohio, which is on the Ohio River, southern Ohio, right across from the state of Kentucky. Portsmouth is, excuse me. Portsmouth is far away, but it's really, for all of us, no matter where we're from, it's really a story that's right around the corner. Portsmouth began as an all-American town for many years. Factories, shoe factories, steel factories, 50,000 people. It was a place where they held the first NFL night game in 1929 from a team that later morphed into the Detroit lions. It had a bustling Main Street. It was selected twice as All-American Town, and at the center of it all, the center of it was this enormous swimming pool the size of a football field, a place that kind of sustained life. You know, people met each other, saw each other, came together. Kids grew up at this swimming pool. The guy who owned it always had a lot of money, so he kept buying more land around it, more land. There was picnic tables and basketball courts, and it became the center of life. The cycle of life took place at this pool. So you were born as a toddler, you swam in the shallow end. Middle school, you were in the middle of the pool, you were diving off the high dive. In high school, you lost your virginity out in the fields of the pool, and your kids started again in the shallow end of this pool, and the name of this pool was Dreamland. Like America, it seemed always to have enough, back then, it seemed always to have enough room for everybody. And was one of the sustainers, I think, of life itself. The end became in 1980 when the steel factory left. A number of shoe factories had also been leaving, and most of them began to really leave. Now half the town's population left. And in 1993, they dug up Dreamland. You can see it on Highway 52, the place where it used to be. It is now an enormous parking lot, literally, with an O'Reilly's auto shop, the auto parts store there. With the end of Dreamland, with the end of this essential component to community in this small American town, the town lost its societal immune system. Very quickly became prey, vulnerable. The way Indians were when the Europeans came over with smallpox, became very quickly vulnerable to this issue of opiate painkiller promotion and eventually addiction. And soon an entire generation of Portsmouth got swept up and addicted to these pills, mainly because Portsmouth became the center, was the place where they invented the pill mill, the doctor prescribing without any diagnosis of pain or anything like that, just basically an unadulterated kind of like scam where he prescribe hundreds of prescriptions every day and send them out, millions and millions of pills getting prescribed every year. They eventually had a town of, by then 20,000 people, had a dozen of these pill mills prescribing 9 million pills a year eventually in Portsmouth, Ohio. They had long lines, people in pajamas, people fighting, people coming from all over different counties, different states. So much so that there developed in Portsmouth an OxyContin economy, an economy where you could buy anything you needed for life itself with pills. Cash didn't matter. They'd rob you in your house, addicts would rob you in your house, they'd take the pills, they wouldn't care about the cash. You could buy T-bone steaks, you could buy children's clothes, you could buy cars, refrigerators, you could pay people's ransoms. People paid kidnappings, ransoms, and pills, refrigerators, cable service, everything you needed for life itself was available with the currency of the pills, because so many of those pills were being prescribed in that area. Walmart turned out to be crucial in this story. They had destroyed, the economy had kind of destroyed Main Street. No more businesses on Main Street. So where is an addict supposed to get all the stuff, to steal all the stuff to be able to make his habit every day? Well, now with OxyContin, taking people's tolerance up to 100, 200, 300 milligrams of opiate OxyContin a day, basically, the only place you could go to find everything that you needed to steal was Walmart. Also, Walmart was a place where no one really cared too deeply. We're paid $9 an hour. No one was going to face off against a wide-eyed junkie trying to steal a chainsaw. All right? My theory is, there's my theory, I don't have anyone to prove it, but my theory is, had we had in many of these areas where this all started, a more diverse and locally owned economic ecosystem where people all own their own shops and that's where people shopped, that this would not have spread nearly as fast, because each owner would have known, each addict would have been there ready to defend his or her shop. But in Walmart, nobody really cared. So basically, people stole enough to start their own shops. People in Portsmouth literally had shops in their apartments full of like baby stuff, baby clothes. All of which was stolen from Walmart, all of which was for sale in this little apartment. Happened all over Portsmouth. In 1998, as all this was just beginning, in 1998, the Jalisco boys, the guys, the heroin traffickers from this small town in the state of Nayarit, Mexico, came east to this area, to Columbus. This is where they landed. They landed at the very moment, this is not a conspiracy tale, okay? There's no conspiracy here, pure coincidence. They landed here with their unbeatable system for distributing heroin retail like pizza. They landed here at the very moment when Purdue Pharma was promoting these pills as if it were completely risk-free. When pill mills were starting an hour and a half, 2 hours away from here in Portsmouth, Ohio, the supply of pills was exploding. And at that very moment, by pure coincidence, one guy, only one guy, starts this, lands here with his system and begins selling black tar heroin into this area where all of a sudden the numbers of addicts are exploding. He doesn't even know what he's got at first. He's a longtime heroin addict himself. At one point, a guy from Wheeling says, "You got to come with me to Wheeling. You'll make a killing if you sell your dope out there." So he does, and he meets a heroin addict there. Now, this heroin addict was surprising to him because she was a woman who had a new car and a new house. Heroin addicts do not have new cars and new houses. And she tries to trade for his black tar heroin, which he has which he thinks is pretty high quality. She tries to trade this bottle of pills. He reads it, he's never heard this. OxyContin, what is this? They have this conversation. It's the way only addicts can have, telling him exactly the story. You sell to people who are addicted to this and you'll make $1 million. This is the new thing. I'm already making a killing doing this. She was buying the pills, Oxy, from seniors in Wheeling and going up to the mountains in West Virginia and selling it for triple. And that's how she had a house and a new car and a heroin addiction at the same time. He figures this out. And that is how this one little group of guys from this one town became. The reason I write about them is because first of all, they're a vanguard of a new way of drug trafficking. Non-violent, using marketing, not gunplay. Not Scarface, not Al Capone, not Bloods and Crips. Trying to make a market through marketing and through selling a very addictive product. But they also are very important to this story because they are the first ones to figure out that if they follow the pills, that they all of a sudden will have this enormous new cornucopia of new customers that they've never had in the western side of the United States because the pills hadn't hit really out there at that point. It was the first time when a group of traffickers figured out that this was happening and then systematically exploited it. And that is how drug trafficking more commonly works. Not some cartel, some guy, some mastermind in Mexico making these big decisions. It's one addict talking to another, one criminal talking to another. And that's how they came here. The guys were the first to, as I say, recognize and exploit this market. They came just as Purdue was doing his thing, recognizing that this area was an area where a lot of people were in pain, and where a lot of doctors, particularly down south and in Appalachia, were used to prescribing. So a new kind of drug trafficking met a vanguard of a new kind of legal drug promotion. Dope giveaways from the Jalisco boys met the free coupons of OxyContin and Purdue Pharma. They would give away, the Jalisco boys would give away methadone, free dope at methadone clinics, just the same way as the friendly visits from doctors, from sales reps to doctors' offices. This was the first time, too, when you began to see what we are now seeing all across the country in every part of America today, and that is people began getting addicted because these pills turned out, yes, to be very addictive, and then developing an enormous tolerance and not being able to find any way of financially sustaining that, and then switching to Mexican heroin, and people dying all along the way. You saw that first in this area where we're sitting right now, late 90s, early 2000s. It was, as I got into this story, part of a national story, I realized. It was spreading now to the rest of the country. It had started in areas that we were used to ignoring, like Appalachia, but by now it had spread to our wealthiest suburbs of Portland, Charlotte, North Carolina, places like that. Children who had benefited most from our economic booms beginning in the 1990s were now getting hooked on drugs used, of all things, to numb pain. And that's when I realized that my background as a crime reporter, that's when I realized that this was really more than a crime story, more than simply a dope book that I was involved in. This was it was really about who and what we'd become as Americans. In my opinion, a big part of this story has to do with the fact that for the last 35 years, we have spent the last 35 years destroying community in America. We have mocked and clawed at the girdings of government, kind of waged war on government that provides the public assets and infrastructure that we take for granted and makes communal life possible. We had a president who said government is the problem. We created a myth that we can kind of make it alone. These were years when I think we were living as if old rules didn't apply to us, that in a democratic nation we can do it all on our own. These were years, for example, when people believed that baseball players could hit more than 60 home runs every year, when it only happened twice in the whole history of the sport, that one guy could win the Tour de France 7 times, when it never happened before. We had bundled, if you've seen The Big Short, it's a great movie, you need to see it, it's all about this topic, I tell you. We could bundle mortgage securities. The worst mortgages in America could be bundled into one big security and stamped by Standard & Poor's and Moody's at AAA, and that made them all of a sudden great things to invest money in. And we believe that opiates in mass supply, massively prescribed to all manner of people, would pose no risk to them of addiction. Meanwhile, I think crucial to all this is that we exalted the private sector, the private in all this. We demanded perfection from government and forgave the private sector its trespasses. This story is all about private profits remaining private while the public sector bears all the costs. Jails, ERs, criminal justice system in general, coroners, etc. The Sackler family, which owns Purdue Pharma, is now one of the wealthiest families in America, wealthier than the Mellons, wealthier than the Rockefellers. $14 billion is their estimated worth by Forbes magazine, due to $35 billion worth of sales of OxyContin since 1996. While we were exalting the private sector, though, we were also fearing the public. This is also crucial, I think, to this story. Parents began to hover over their kids, afraid that if they went outside that they would be somehow molested or taken or hurt in some way, afraid that they would feel pain. It was part of our idea that we were entitled to a life without pain, fearing pain above all, afraid that they would fail, in an attempt to kind of keep them from the consequences of their failure. The Atlantic Monthly wrote a story that I thought was fantastic about kids who grew up in an era of hyperprotection from physical pain. We're now demanding to be protected from painful ideas as well, an outgrowth of this whole idea that you should be and can be protected from pain at all costs. These kids were demanding professors provide trigger warnings in advance of ideas that might provoke a strong emotional content, say a novel that describes racial or domestic violence. Psychology Today ran a story that I also love called Declining Student Resilience, that noticed increased neediness in college students, that students had called campus police after seeing a mouse, blaming teachers for poor grades, and, quote, increasingly seeking help for and apparently having emotional crises over problems of everyday life. As a country, meanwhile, I think we acted as if consumption and the accumulation of stuff was the path to happiness. We built isolation into our suburbs, and we called that prosperity. Added to that mix was the expansion of technology. that connects us, I think, to the world but separates us from our next door neighbors. We pretend that we're informed by 24-hour cable news, who are, in my opinion, simply dealers in the drug of outrage. They provide little information, mostly heat, alarm, frenzy, and isolation that separates us from each other and envelops us in a luxurious warmth of outrage that feels so good. 24-hour news is just like heroin, in my opinion. Just as addicts kind of meet together and know each other and don't associate with anybody who isn't like them, doesn't have their same interest in dope, that's exactly what 24-hour news has done to us politically, formed us into groups in which we are afraid to talk to anybody who doesn't believe like us, doesn't talk to us, doesn't talk like us. The result of all this, in my opinion, of all this really and a whole lot more, is that we wound up dangerously separate from each other, whether in poverty or in affluence, just like Portsmouth after Dreamland closed. Kids no longer play in the street. We have parks nobody uses. Dreamland lies buried underneath a strip mall. Why then do we wonder that heroin is everywhere in our country today? Our very search for painlessness, for comfort, led us to it. Heroin is the final expression of values we have fostered for 35 years. It turns every addict into a narcissistic, self-absorbed, solitary, hyper-consumer, buying one thing over as the final stuff in a culture that values stuff as the path to happiness. A life that finds opiates turns away from family and community and devotes itself entirely to self-gratification by buying and consuming, as I said, one product, a drug that most makes. This product is the drug that most makes being alone not just all right, but preferable. This epidemic has taken place. If the crack epidemic had the crack house, kind of the hallmark of that epidemic, this one has the private bedroom. Those same private bedrooms that mothers and fathers thought were so safe for their kids, that's exactly where kids are hiding their dope, shooting up their dope, and dying. Isolation. Isolation is heroin's natural habitat. And thus I believe more strongly than ever that the antidote to heroin is not naloxone, it is community. If you want to keep kids off heroin, make sure people in your neighborhood do things together, in public, often. Break down those barriers that keep people isolated. Create your own dreamland in your area, in your school, in your block. Bring people out of their private rooms, whatever form those rooms take. The good news is, I'm here to tell you, that there is no solution. We tried the solitary solution, right? We tried pills for everybody, one thing, no problem, everybody saying one size fits all. We tried tough on crime as the sole solution to addiction, right? We have seen parents all alone in their rooms crying, terrified that someone will find out how their children really died. Isolation. Ooh, watch out. The idea that we can do it all alone. We don't need each other. I think it's time we stop believing that there's an easy way out, that old rules don't apply, and that we have no need for each other. Self-governance is complicated and difficult and comes in small pieces. No, there is no solution. There are many solutions. And they are each part of a community of solution. This story is about isolation versus community. And these solutions come together. Happily, none of them, very happily I'd say, none of them is sexy. Doctors and nurses need to stop prescribing so many of these pills. There's no solution to this problem that doesn't involve that. They need to more judiciously assess each patient. Insurance companies need to start reimbursing for a wider variety of pain strategies. Hospital administrators must take doctor evaluations out of calculations for how doctors are paid and retained. American patients, you and I, we all must start taking broader accountability for our health, wellness, emotional, physical, and neighborhood health. We must come to understand the importance of community and stop allowing or fight to prevent things that destroy it, such as job exportation. Heroin is what you get when you destroy dreamland. We need to, I think, tax pills to pay for treatment. We need to demand our government stop allowing pharma ads on TV. I think we need to rethink how we do jail. And we need to depend, as I say, all of us, less on pills as solutions. We shouldn't expect easily defined problems and easily applied solutions. The best good news, though, is that this problem is no longer hidden. When I was writing my book, I felt very alone. I felt no parents wanted to talk about this. The country in general didn't want to talk about this. I knew how widespread it was. But I also knew that nobody wanted to talk about that. That has changed. You work as professionals in this, or you're becoming pharmaceutical students right now, pharmacy students right now. You are coming into a great new era when regarding this topic. No longer just a thin line of government employees are protecting us from opiate mayhem. There's now people all across this country who are fighting to make this an issue that people need to address and devote budget to and new policies to. As professionals, you need to be, in my opinion, out front and vocal about this. You need to get to know reporters, cops, write letters to the editor of your local newspaper, volunteer to talk to young kids in schools, and in every region you need to know that there are now people all across there desperate to get the word out, who've lost their fear, parents mainly who have lost their fear. Find them, work with them, give them the boost, the encouragement they need. They need you, and they will thank you for your work. I don't know what the specific solution is in each of your towns or counties. I do believe, though, in the coming together, in forming community around this, acting like Americans. Again, sharing ideas, talents, budget, expertise. In isolation, all problems are insoluble. Indeed, it seems to me, heroin is fearsome enough, apparently, to make us kind of come together. At least in some cases. What heroin does to users, their families, and their neighborhoods is so harrowing that heroin reminds those who live through it of the ties that bind them to others, producing in some places the opposite effect that it does in users. It may be, in fact, heroin may be one of the great forces for change in our country today, which is why I love the story of Portsmouth, Ohio. When I was writing this book, I was very aware that I could not write a book about a downer topic and have it be downer, degradation, destruction, despair, the end. I wouldn't have even wanted to read that book. But I was stunned and surprised to find that the place where I found hope, some kind of redemption, some kind of reason to feel that there was an answer to this, was the town that led us into this in the first place, that was most beaten down. In fact, when you go to Portsmouth, it looks like a beaten down addict, a junkie from the streets. Abandoned buildings, hookers by the tracks, etc., pawn shops, check cashing places all over. I thought I would go there for 2 days. I ended up going there 6 times, each time for about 5 days to, to a week. For a long time, Portsmouth bought the dogma that was sold by Wall Street and the University of Chicago and various administrations, who were a country of financial services, and so manufacturing needs to go to Malaysia or someplace, or Mexico for all that. And they bought that idea. They bought that they were worth nothing. People left in droves. They figured that the people were voting with their feet, and this was the truth of the town. The pills came through, and at first, of course, you probably know the effect is to further and reinforce the fatalism, the inertia, the despair. But as time went on, I began to see that there was another story developing in this small American town in the heartland. And that was one of self-reliance. And it began really with a bizarre story that I stumbled upon. It had nothing to do with heroin. It had to do, in fact, with, in Portsmouth there was, for many years, an enormous shoelace manufacturer. The largest shoelace manufacturer in America was down in Portsmouth, Ohio, for many years. It went through a lot of changes. It reduced, but it hung on for many years. until finally in 2009 it filed for bankruptcy, largely because of poor management decisions by the family that by now the third generation of this family was running it. For years, this had happened in America, in Portsmouth, and they had simply decided, okay, we'll let this happen. They just let these jobs go. This was the first time, 2009, 2010, when people in the town said, we cannot let this continue. And people in the town, who knew nothing about shoelace manufacturing, bought the company out of bankruptcy. They came and they were contractors, insurance salesmen, lawyers. They put their money together, bought the company out of bankruptcy, hired the managers who knew how to run the company well. And this company, Mitchell Lace, now known as Sole Choice, it's a fantastic story, now employs something on the order of 80 people, has been exporting shoelaces now to Taiwan, to Italy, to Mexico, and to China. But it was part of a larger story. A much larger story of recovery in this beaten down town, because as time went on, I began to realize that was just the beginning of it. In 2011, the state passes a law regulating pill mills so that, among other things, a felon can no longer run a pain clinic. That used to be possible under the old way. They close all those noxious, nasty pill mills in Portsmouth, Ohio, and all of a sudden, all that enormous generation of kids and middle-aged people too, who had gotten addicted to dope, had breathing room between them and the pills, between them and the dope. And what I began to notice was, as I got to Portsmouth, as I began to spend more and more and more time in the town, was that there was another story. The negative story was there for sure, but another story was fighting to compete with it. A story of recovery, of self-reliance, of not believing everything that Wall Street says about you, of relying on instead of just relinquishing your economic fate, fighting to retain it. It was a story, a beautifully American story. I found as I went along, I began to see that in Portsmouth also, they had reformed city government. Now they had a city manager instead of just the mayor running things. The mayor didn't know how to run a town, became a kind of complete improvisation. Now with the city manager, the trash got picked up on time, lights got put in the parks. All of a sudden, solutions to what people thought were insoluble problems began to take place because people were coming together. A town that had been completely fragmented and atomized was coming together. At the same time, because of this distance, all of a sudden, with the lack of, with the closure of the pill mills, all of a sudden, addicts all across Portsmouth and in the Scioto County had space. A recovery culture began to develop out of all this. So no longer was it, as one woman told me, no longer was it cool, the dominant culture, simply let's steal the copper wire from the school and go get high. There was a competing culture, a recovery culture. NA meetings started up all over Portsmouth. Today you can go to NA meetings in almost every day of the week, almost any time of the day. There's dozens of them. The counseling center, the small little counseling center that exists in Portsmouth, began to expand, became one of the largest employers in the town, and definitely the largest employer of ex-felons. Those kids who are the folks who are in recovery are now studying to be social workers and addiction counselors at Shawnee State University in town. The way Portsmouth, this small, beat-down, heartland American town, is showing accountability for its social and economic health is what we have to do with our own bodies as Americans. Take accountability for our own decisions. We have to question the drugs marketed to us. Question doctors when they prescribe 60 Vicodin for every wisdom tooth, or dentist for every wisdom tooth extraction. We need to demand our grocers stock better food. We need to work out. We need to get better exercise together. Stop demanding doctors magically fix us somehow. It will then, I bet, matter far less what new product a drug company devises. I end the book this way, talking about Portsmouth. So the battered old town had hung on. It was somehow a beacon, embracing shivering and hollow-eyed junkies, letting them know that all was not lost, that at the bottom of the rubble was a place just like them, kicked and buried, but surviving. A place that had, like them, shredded and lost so much that was precious, but was nurturing it again. Though they were adrift, they too could begin to find their way back to that place called Dreamland. Thank you very much.